Welcome to this podcast of Super Special Kids and Cake. Yes, cake! I'm Granny Rhea.
And I'm Auntie Donia.
We're coming to you from the studios of Sacred Heart University in Fairfield, Connecticut. This podcast is brought to you by our book, Let's Talk, Navigating Communication Services and Supports for Your Young Child with Autism, published by Paul H. Brooks and available from Amazon.com.
As you know, every week we introduce a super special topic. These topics concern things that excite or aggravate us about trends in the field of special education. We may have some ideas that others don't always agree with, but we really do enjoy discussing them. Our super special topic of today is girls and autism.
Girls have autism too, although we very often think of autism as a condition that we see in boys. There is a higher number of boys than girls who have autism. Generally, the figures people cite are about 4 boys for every girl who have the condition. But there certainly are girls. What do we know about girls with autism, Auntie Donia?
So we know that girls with autism present differently, and we sometimes see an exaggeration of the normal gender differences. I mean, little girls can be more sociable than little boys as well. So we see that they may be hypersocial, very aware of the social needs, the needs to be accepted. They have a desire to have friends, but their interpretation of what friendships are and what being sociable means may not be what we would consider sort of more typical, and therefore they can sometimes find themselves in situations that can be difficult and challenging.
And can be challenging for the people they choose as friends as well.
That's right.
I remember one young woman with ASD who I worked with who claimed that her best friend was the teller at the bank where she deposited her paychecks every week. And her idea of friendship was that she would go and talk to this teller for a somewhat extended period of time. And I'm not sure that the teller appreciated it or interpreted their interactions the same way that the young lady did.
I had a very similar example, Granny Rhea. I was conducting the ADOS, and part of the ADOS assessment, you inquire about friendship. And so I had asked this young lady, I think she was about perhaps 18, 19 years old, tell me somebody that you can tell your secrets to, you go shopping together, they help you with things. And she listed, sort of described this person who sort of would meet that criteria. But then when I dug a little deeper, I discovered that this was actually the housekeeper who her mother pays. But she still considered this person her friend.
Yeah, and again, I think what we see in girls with autism is that even though they're interested in relationships with other people, perhaps somewhat more interested than boys are, although there are plenty of boys with autism who are very interested as well. And their approaches may be somewhat unusual or inappropriate, but for the very high-functioning girls, sometimes they can essentially mimic what other people are doing and make themselves look more appropriate. But what's missing is what we in the autism world call the mind-reading capacity, the ability to see, for example, that when you're talking to the bank teller is getting more and more anxious as you take more and more of her time and the line behind you gets longer and longer. And to interpret those behaviors as signals that the young lady should now terminate the conversation and let the bank teller move on. It's that kind of ability to put yourself in other people's shoes that's really a base characteristic of autism in both boys and girls, although in girls sometimes the aloofness that we often see in boys, though not always, but that aloofness may be missing, and the underlying difficulty in understanding and interpreting others' states of mind can still be there.
And I find that therapeutically, when I'm working with girls who have autism, that a lot of our work is around that interpretation, friendships, and just like you said, sort of reading the cues, that if somebody starts looking away, that means that they don't want to talk about this anymore, and being aware of sort of the conversations that they may be leading or the topics that they want to talk about. There was a young woman that I worked with who her interest was, hairdressing, and she always wanted, and she would comment on the person's hair, but after a while, the people that she was speaking to, or the girls at school, would become irritated by that.
Yeah, and that, of course, we see in boys, too.
Sure.
I've seen lots of boys with autism who have an interest, for example, in Star Wars, and will talk about it ad nauseum, despite whatever signals they might get from their peers, who might also like Star Wars, but not quite as much as the child with autism. So there are certainly parallels, similarities between the presentation in boys and girls, but girls can be a little tougher to see as being on the autism spectrum, and they often do get misdiagnosed as having other mental health conditions.
That's right. They do. They can get diagnosed either with social anxiety or with OCD. But Granny Rhea, one of the things too is that the younger girls, so when I think of my early intervention little ones that I see, they actually present very similarly. And also the children who have more cognitive difficulties too. I think boys and girls appear very, very much so the same. But it's our children that are more verbal that we would say are, I don't want to say higher functioning, but that we would say
cognitively advanced.
Exactly, more cognitively advanced. They're the ones where we do see this more sort of hypersocialness as well.
Yes, and also the capacity to kind of hide behind the hypersocialness, which makes it a little bit harder for them to be diagnosed. So we do, if you look around on the internet for information about girls with autism, one thing you will find is that many of the women who have it talk about the fact that they weren't diagnosed early, that they struggled for a long time to find a way to interact with others, and it wasn't until rather late in life that they obtained a diagnosis.
There was a lady that I know who had said, again, she was diagnosed much later on, but she said that her teacher had said to her, "You're too poor at maths to have ASD," and that's, again, that sort of misinterpretation that anybody with autism has those sort of splinter skills or those savant skills.
Yes, and the other place where girls differ from boys is that they show less tendency to have those repetitive behaviors that we see in kids with autism, the flapping and the finger twiddling and things like that are just, you walk into a room and you know the child has autism. Girls tend not to do those things quite so much, and again, that complicates the diagnostic picture.
But in terms of the interventions, they're going to be very similar. And so if you have any concerns, again, speak to your health practitioner and to get the support that you need.
Yes, and if you are just generally concerned about a girl and you don't know what the diagnosis is, you don't know if she has anxiety or autism or affective problems, definitely it makes sense to talk to a professional and try to sort out the symptoms and decide what's going to be the best help for her. Because many psychiatric conditions now, conditions like depression or anxiety, are very treatable with medication. And medication helps a lot. It helps both kids who have autism with mental health conditions and those who have mental health conditions without autism. We certainly want to provide that help to any child that needs it. But if there is an autistic component to the disorder, then we want to look more to behavioral treatments and at least combine the medical treatment with the behavioral treatment to make sure that the child begins to develop these skills to understand and interpret others' behavior that will enable them to be more successful and integrate more easily into the community.
That's such an important point, Granny Rhea, and I think for our parents to know that it can be co-occurring. So you can have the depression or the anxiety that can coexist with the autism as well.
Yes, and in fact, statistics tell us that the co-occurrence of other mental health conditions with autism in both boys and girls is quite high. Nearly half of children diagnosed with autism also qualify for a diagnosis of attention deficit disorder. Nearly a third qualify for a definition of depression, and over 50% qualify for a diagnosis of anxiety. Each of those is treatable in and of itself. The treatment for these conditions won't cure the autism, but it will alleviate symptoms and hopefully make life easier. So we want to make sure that we attend to all the conditions that our kids with autism are facing.
Our super special question for today is, what is selective mutism?
Selective mutism, that's a term we don't hear too often, isn't it, Auntie Donia?
It really is. It really is. I know in my clinical practice, I think I've only had perhaps 3 children referred to me with potential selective mutism.
I've only had one.
And actually that's across country. So I would say probably per country, that's just one as well. And this was something that recently came up. A parent contacted me to say that she was concerned that her child had selective mutism, and the little girl was only 4. What was concerning to me was that the professional that she had seen had recommended medication as the first form of treatment. And we know that medication can be useful, but certainly I would never recommend that as the first point of intervention or treatment.
Sure, you generally want to start with some behavioral treatment, and there are very effective behavioral treatments for selective mutism. Let's just talk a little bit about what the term means. When I was in training, we called it elective mutism, because the idea was that the child was electing or choosing to be mute rather than that there was so it was almost a kind of the child's fault that they were electively mute. The name changed to selective mutism probably somewhere in the 80s or 90s, and that was meant to suggest that the child is refusing to talk only in certain situations. And that is part of the definition of selective mutism. In order to be diagnosed with selective mutism, the child must talk in some places, usually home, and not talk in other places, usually school. So selective mutism really refers to a very special kind of child, a child who can talk in some places and can't talk in others.
So with the example of this little girl that I had seen, this 4-year-old, she will speak to her mother, and she will even say to her mother, "I wish I could talk," but when she's at school, she doesn't speak to any of her friends. She will occasionally raise her hand. If the teacher calls on her, she will answer the question, but she doesn't choose to raise her hand. But if she's with any other family members, she doesn't say anything at all.
Yeah, and interestingly, selective mutism is much more common in girls than in boys, more than a 4-to-1 ratio. Although it is quite rare in the population in general, I believe the prevalence is about 0.1% of the population, 1 in 1,000. So it doesn't happen too often. But when it does, the child must meet those criteria that they do talk somewhere. Now, the problem comes in when you have a child who isn't talking at all. Who has never talked and who really is unable to talk anywhere. And that child should never get a diagnosis of selective mutism. That child is what we would call nonverbal or perhaps preverbal, depending on his age. So we do want to make that distinction. So what do we do about kids that have selective mutism, Auntie Donia?
So with this particular little girl, I worked together with a psychologist, and we worked on addressing her. So it really seemed that it was more of a social anxiety. There were situations that she was afraid of. And so we used a sort of cognitive behavioral approach to support her, and very slowly we created situations where she would be more comfortable, and she was able to then very slowly express herself and communicate in other environments. But I think for her, it's always going to be something that will be anxiety provoking for her, but no longer sort of functionally impacting her, that she's not able to do the everyday things that she needs to do, like being at school and speaking to teachers and peers.
Yes, and in my experience, most treatment for kids with selective mutism is a team-based approach between a speech-language pathologist and a psychologist. The psychologist may work directly on the anxiety, the kind of general anxiety that the child feels in a variety of situations, and the speech-language pathologist will generally take a behavioral approach, trying to reward attempts to speak, maybe only at first rewarding vocalizations, saying mm-hmm or aha, and then moving up slowly providing lots of comfort and also lots of reward or reinforcement for beginning to vocalize and then to talk. And these treatments are generally quite effective. They can take some time, but they do generally result in the child's being able to talk, at least in important environments like school. Again, sometimes medication helps because many children with selective mutism do have diagnosable anxiety disorders that can be treated with medication. But again, it's interesting that the medication itself doesn't get rid of the selective mutism. It can get rid of some of the anxiety, but the child still needs, in some sense, to relearn how to talk in certain settings.
That's right. And once they feel that they can be comfortable. I mean, with this little girl, it was sort of one of the things that we did was we went out for lunch with the family, and all she was expected to do was to sort of ask for what she wanted to eat. But if she wanted to sit there quietly, that was okay. And I think there's also the expectation from other family members that she doesn't have to be speaking all the time and always answering questions.
Sure, because some of us are shy. I know I tend to be kind of shy, and when I go out with a group of people, especially people I don't know too well, I will, say what I need to say, but I tend to sit back and listen more than I talk. And, these kids may grow up to be more on that side of the spectrum of social interactiveness.
Granny Rhea, what is the topic for this episode that makes us go, aargh?
Well, I thought we might talk a little bit about toys. So many kids with special needs get presents from parents and grandparents, and it's great that parents and grandparents and other friends are thinking about toys that will be developmentally appropriate for the child, that the child will enjoy. But one thing that sometimes bothers me a little bit is that people often buy toys for kids with special needs that are stereotyped for their gender. So boys get footballs and girls get baby dolls.
Exactly.
And I mean, that's fine. If they enjoy those things, that's great. But there's so much that can be learned from playing with pretend play toys. Things like dolls or action figures. Boys often like action figures. Or playing in a setting that allows the child to imagine their own actions. So I just like to see kids given the opportunity to play with a range of toys, even if other boys or other girls might not choose those toys as their first pick. What do you think, Auntie Donia?
I agree with you, Granny Rhea. I think toys should be really gender neutral, because I've seen this both in my clinical practice, but again with the little ones like my nieces and nephews. Well, my nephew loves using his sister's like cooking corner and pretending to cook things. And she loves playing with his Lego and his sort of more mechanical, like they have this great like magnet toy where they can build all sorts of things. And what I love seeing is how they mix those together. So they could together build some kind of sort of mechanical, using their magnet toys, some kind of castle, some kind of structure, and then the different dolls come in. So I think it's really important, as you said, Granny Rhea, that the toys are used and the pretend play are used by all children, because we know that for our super special kids, when they develop their pretend play skills, that supports the development of other cognitive skills as well.
Absolutely. That's really the important point, Auntie Donia, that language grows out of pretend play. And the reason is that both language and pretend are forms of what the great psychologist Piaget called mental representation. When we play, we have to project an idea onto a toy. So we pretend that a Lego block is a car, and in doing that, we project the idea of a car onto the Lego block, and we have to hold that idea in mind and keep it going against the reality that this thing doesn't have wheels and it doesn't beep and so on. That is very analogous to what we have to do when we use words. When we use words, we have to do the same thing. We have to summon up that picture of a car in our mind and then hook that word car onto it while we hold the picture. And that ability to symbolically represent ideas with words or with pretend play is that those two activities are very closely linked. We know that kids that are better at pretend play tend to learn language better. And what we want is to give our kids the opportunity to engage in that kind of pretend play as often as possible. And I think there are some ways of using toys to facilitate that. Would you agree, Auntie Donia?
Absolutely, absolutely, very much so. And the other thing that we see with play is that it supports sequences and language. When we speak, language is sequential. So if a child knows that, the little man goes into the car and then the car zooms and goes somewhere, and then the man gets out and he goes into a boat or has a picnic, that sequence of play that they are able, that kind of scheme that they're able to map out through their play would then be transferred to language. So both in their ability to talk about something, to tell a story, but in their ability to understand that sequence as well.
Right, and that ability to articulate ideas through words and then to string ideas together in a logical sequence is what's going to lead to the ability to produce what we call narratives and what are often called stories. Now, a lot of us think of stories as being kind of play and not very important, but stories are the basis of so much of the understanding of events in the world. When it comes to social studies, kids have to be able to get the story of what happened when the Americans decided to revolt from the British and so on. It's not just a random sequence of events, it's a sequence that's linked by people's plans and intentions. And play supports that development from the earliest phases and continues to support it through the elementary years. So as adults, we want to give kids as many chances to do that kind of imagining and putting together ideas to create a coherent sequence that will support the development of basic language and then of more advanced language that will help them with their academics.
And I would say that if you're thinking of which toys to buy for children, they don't have to be expensive toys, they could be everyday items that you have at home, but really to think of them in terms of categories. So what are the things that would encourage pretend play? What are the things that would encourage more sort of that cognitive play of sort of putting things together? So things like puzzles or Duplo or Legos. What are the items that they could use that would be more for exploratory play, and really thinking of it in terms of those categories rather than these are for boys and these are for girls.
Auntie Donia, what's our eating cake for breakfast topic today?
Our eating cake for breakfast is all about the classic games that you can play with your children in any place, at home or out and about. So games like hide and seek, treasure hunts and tag.
And also games like hopscotch and duck, duck, goose and freeze, and lots of games that are lots of fun for typical kids and for super special kids as well. I think one of the issues that comes up with super special kids and games is that they're mostly played with other kids. And so the super special kid might have some trouble with that for a variety of reasons, either because of their social problems for kids with autism, because of their motor problems for kids with cerebral palsy, because of their hearing problems for kids who are deaf. There are lots of barriers. So how do we address those barriers, Auntie Donia?
So the way to do that is to keep the games simple and for the instructions to be very clear and for the adult to support the child as well. So for example, if you're playing musical chairs, we know that when the music stops, a chair is removed and that person comes out. But for the super special kid, that can be really difficult for the first round. So the first round is simply, or first couple of times you play it, when the music stops, you sit down. When the music starts, you start moving and dancing again. So finding ways to modify the game. So we use the term often scaffolding, which is how you simplify something for the child to be successful, but still independent. So it doesn't mean that you've got to hold the child's hand. You may have to guide them. You may have to use a visual cue to stop, so raising your hand up. I know that when I've done simple treasure hunts with the children, we'll do it so that, the toy or whatever is hidden is a little bit more obvious. The other thing I think to consider is that the timing. So whereas some of our more typical children would be able to play these games for extended periods of time, we want our super special kids to feel very successful. And so having these games for short periods of time.
Yeah, so if you're organizing play dates for your child and maybe you want to structure the play dates a little bit to make sure that they go well, you might suggest that they play tag or musical chairs for 3 or 4 minutes, and then maybe give them a little snack, and then maybe suggest that they do something else. So controlling the time period can be helpful. The other thing I think can be helpful sometimes is being a little flexible about the rules. So, for example, in a game like musical chairs or dodgeball, where somebody is always out, if your super special child isn't ready to be out, you can usually finagle a bit with the other kids so that he gets another chance. But with a reminder, okay, remember, when you get hit with the ball, it's your turn to stand in the circle, and perhaps providing some sort of reward for complying with the rule the second time around. But if we can avoid getting the child so upset about having to comply with a rule that they can play the game a little bit longer, we may be enhancing their chances of ultimately understanding and being able to participate.
Because one of the skills that this teaches is the different roles that we have. So I've sometimes played this where the super special child is the one that stops the music, or they're the one that helps move the chairs around. And you can also, for games like tag, it doesn't have to be contact. It can be contactless. Mm-hmm. So this idea actually I got from my little nephew who plays rugby. And for the junior rugby, they're not allowed to tackle each other. So they have a ribbon that is sort of tucked behind them that they pull. So something like that for the children that perhaps don't like the sort of contact, you can find ways to modify it as well. The other suggestion is to have a little choice board where you can have the images of the different games that you're going to play so that the children can choose which one they want to play. And as Granny Rhea said, if you've got a play date, you can also have a mini schedule made out so that the children know which games are coming up and when they're going to have snack.
And we want to make sure that both kids have a chance to choose. So if you do make a choice board, which you can do on your iPhone with just 4 pictures of photographs of your child playing this game at some other time, or a drawing that you can find on image search. If you do that, make sure that your child understands he gets to choose sometimes and the friend gets to choose sometimes too. Because we want to encourage our children to take part in all the normal activities that other kids are doing, and sometimes that they'll need just a little bit of help to do that. So here comes our favorite part of the podcast, the eating cake part. And today we have a yummy, scrumptious, very rich-looking vanilla cake that's got a buttercream base, and there's icing in the middle. I'm really looking forward to trying that icing. What do you think?
Me too. I wish you could see this because this really looks so delicious.
Appetizing. Yes. All right. Let's give it a shot. Okay, here we go.
That is delicious.
The Let's Talk About Super Special Kids and Cake podcast would like to thank our host, Sacred Heart University's School of Communication and Media Studies. We'd also like to thank our composer, Marty Eisenberg, our audio editor, Brent Morton, and our audio engineer and director of cake-based operations, Keith Stryovi.
Thank you for listening to today's episode. If you enjoyed this podcast, please give us a review.